What would you do if you watched someone get humiliated in front of hundreds of people? And nobody said a word? I'm going to tell you a story about a man who thought money made him untouchable. A man who looked at a young woman and saw nothing. And I'm going to tell you about the moment his entire world collapsed, right there in front of everyone he'd spent his life trying to impress. Stay with me. Because this one hits different. The Harrington Foundation Gala was the kind of event that made regular people feel small just reading about it. $500 a plate, black tie mandatory. The venue, a restored heritage ballroom in downtown Toronto, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers and waitstaff, who looked like they'd been trained specifically not to make eye contact with anyone who earned less than six figures. Every autumn, Clifford Harrington hosted this gala to celebrate the foundation that bore his name. Ostensibly, it was about charity. Scholarships for business students, grants for innovation, that kind of thing. In practice, everyone knew it was about Clifford. It was always about Clifford. Clifford Harrington, 71 years old, silver-haired and barrel-chested, the kind of man who filled a room not with warmth but with pressure. He'd built Harrington Capital from a mid-sized brokerage into one of the most respected private equity firms in the country. 3 decades of aggressive acquisitions, calculated risks, and a reputation for being the smartest person in any room he entered, a reputation he did nothing to discourage. His handshake lasted exactly 2 seconds. His eye contact was a test. He'd made and unmade careers with a single phone call, and he knew it, and he wanted you to know it too. His wife, Elaine Harrington, 68, stood beside him most evenings exactly the way a decorative column stands beside a building, present, elegant, structurally invisible. She wore ivory that night, pearls at her throat, a smile that had long since detached itself from anything she actually felt. Their son, Bennett Harrington, 34, tall and quietly handsome with his father's jaw and none of his father's cruelty, had been dreading this evening for 2 weeks, because he was bringing someone his father had never approved of. Her name was Zara Okonkwo-Reid, 29 years old. She arrived that night in a deep burgundy dress that she'd bought from a thrift store in Kensington Market, and altered herself. Taken in at the waist, hemmed perfectly, a small repair at the left shoulder seam invisible unless you knew where to look. She was slender and dark-skinned, with close-cropped natural hair and calm, watchful eyes that missed nothing. She worked as a registered nurse at St. Michael's Hospital, night shifts mostly, and she had a 4-year-old daughter named Amira from a relationship that had ended before Amira was born. She did not own a car. She took the TTC to work. She paid her rent on the first of every month without fail. She was, by every measure that Clifford Harrington recognized, nobody. Bennett had met her 14 months earlier in the emergency room, not as a patient, but as the person who'd calmly talked him through what to do while his colleague collapsed at a work event and they waited for the paramedics. She'd been finishing a double shift. She hadn't known who he was. She'd just been competent and steady and human in a way that had knocked something loose in him. He'd asked for her number before the ambulance doors closed. She'd made him ask twice. They'd been together ever since. Clifford had known about Zara for 8 months. He'd expressed his disapproval in the precise, controlled way he expressed all disapproval. Not with shouting, but with silence, with careful questions designed to demean, with the occasional remark, dropped like a stone into still water, about what was appropriate for a man in Bennett's position. A single mother, Bennett. Really? Is that where we are? He'd never addressed Zara by name. When forced to acknowledge her existence, he called her your friend. Bennett had spent 8 months trying to manage the situation. Trying to broker peace that was never going to come. Trying to be diplomatic about something that didn't deserve diplomacy. Tonight was meant to be a turning point. He'd told his father that Zara would be attending the gala. He'd told his father that she was his partner, that he was serious about her, and that he expected her to be treated accordingly. Clifford had said, "Fine, bring her," in the tone of a man who has already decided exactly how the evening will go. Zara had known it would be difficult. She wasn't naive. She'd grown up in Scarborough, the daughter of a Ghanaian father and a Jamaican-Canadian mother, and she had spent her entire adult life navigating spaces that weren't built for her. She knew how to hold herself still when someone looked through her. She'd learned that particular skill young. What she hadn't expected was how fast it would start. They arrived at 7:15. The ballroom was already full, 300 people in their finest, the low murmur of money and self-congratulation hanging over everything like expensive perfume. Bennett kept his hand at the small of her back. She kept her chin level. Clifford found them within 4 minutes. He materialized out of the crowd the way powerful men do. Not by moving quickly, but by having the space part for him. Elaine was at his side, eyes already doing that thing where they assessed Zara's dress in one sweep and found the verdict before the trial began. Bennett. Clifford's voice was a handshake. Firm. Brief. Dad. Bennett put his arm around Zara. You remember Zara? Clifford looked at her. Not at her face, at the dress, at the shoes, sensible block heels, burgundy to match, not designer, at her hair. The look lasted maybe 3 seconds and contained a full paragraph. I didn't realize the dress code was optional, Clifford said. The sentence landed in the small space between them like something thrown. Zara did not flinch. She met his eyes, steady, direct. The way she looked at frightened patients when she needed them to trust her, and said nothing. Dad. Bennett's voice dropped half a register. I'm simply noting, Clifford said, smoothly, the way he said everything that wasn't smooth at all, that this is a black tie event. There's a standard. She looks beautiful, Bennett said. She looks like she came to the wrong party, Clifford said. And then, to Zara directly, for the first time, in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough. I'm sure you're a very nice girl, but this isn't really your kind of room, is it? It wasn't a question. Around them, a small radius of people had gone quiet. Not obviously. Just that subtle social dampening, the way sound drops when something uncomfortable is happening and no one wants to be the person who reacts. Elaine said nothing. Zara said, It's a lovely venue. Clifford smiled. The smile of a man who has won before the game started is, Bennett tells me you're a nurse. I am night shifts. He let the pause do the work. That must be tiring, especially with a child at home. It is, Zara said. I manage, yes, I imagine you do. And there it was, buried in the compliment, the diminishment. I imagine you do. Little people manage. It's what they're for. Bennett's jaw had gone tight. Zara felt his hand press slightly harder against her back. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Not here. Not yet. She knew how to read the room. She'd been reading rooms like this her whole life. Clifford turned back to Bennett. Zara, having been assessed, categorized, and dismissed, ceased to exist for him. He began talking about someone from the board. A deal. Something about a portfolio company in Vancouver. The conversation moved around Zara like water around a stone, and Zara stood there in her altered thrift store dress and said nothing, and watched and waited. The evening moved forward. It got worse. At the cocktail hour, Clifford introduced Bennett to 3 different people without mentioning Zara at all. She stood at Bennett's side and was simply not named. One of the women, the wife of a board member, 60s, heavy jewelry, looked at Zara the way you look at a valet ticket you're not sure you need to keep. At the dinner table, round, 10 seats, white linen, more crystal than was strictly necessary. Clifford was seated 2 places away, close enough. The conversation turned, inevitably, to the Foundation's newest scholarship recipients. Business students, said a man named Roland Finch Carey, 60s. Red-faced and jovial in the way of men who've never been told no, are the backbone of this country. Get the right minds in the right rooms early, and you set the trajectory. Absolutely, said another guest. Investment in human capital, some human capital, Clifford said mildly, refilling his wine, has a higher rate of return than others. His eyes moved, very briefly, to Zara. She was cutting her beef tenderloin into precise pieces, her expression unhurried. If she heard, and she heard, she gave no sign. Bennett set down his fork. Dad, I'm speaking generally, Bennett. No, Bennett said. You're not. The table went still. Clifford looked at his son with the patience of a man who has spent 30 years being the smartest person in the room and sees no reason tonight should be different. I think perhaps Zara is my partner, Bennett said. His voice was quiet and absolute, not angry. Absolute. She is at this table because I brought her here. You will speak to her with respect, or we will leave. Clifford's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something cooled. You're making a scene, Clifford said. You started it 4 minutes after we walked in the door, Bennett said. I'm finishing it. Elaine put her hand on Clifford's arm. Whether in support or in warning, nobody at the table could tell. I have given you everything, Clifford said, low and even, as if the table didn't exist, as if it was just the two of them. Everything. This firm, this family, this name. And you want to throw it away on... Don't, Bennett said. On someone who doesn't belong here. Dad, stop. Who cannot give you what you need. Who has a child that isn't yours. Who works night shifts and takes the subway and has no idea what your life actually requires. Then I'll learn. Clifford stared at his son. If that's what you choose, Clifford said, and his voice had gone to something cold and final, the voice of a man making a business decision, then you are no longer my son. Not in any way that matters. Not professionally. Not in this family. You walk out of here with her tonight, and you walk out of everything. The firm, the inheritance, my name. The table was silent in the way that only happens when something irreversible has just been said in public. Bennett Harrington looked at his father for a long moment. He thought about 20 years of Sunday dinners that had felt like board meetings. He thought about a graduation his father had left early to take a call. He thought about the way Zara had sat beside his hospital bed for 4 hours last February when he had the flu, just sat there, doing her crossword puzzle, not making a thing of it, just being present in the uncomplicated way that she was always present. He pushed back his chair. Zara, he said, do you want to go? Zara set down her fork. She folded her napkin. She looked at Clifford Harrington. Looked at him the way she sometimes looked at a patient who was frightened and making it someone else's problem, with something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt and was somehow worse than both. It was nice to meet you, she said, and then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen. Her expression did something. A flicker, controlled immediately. She looked at Bennett. I need to take this, she said quietly, outside. He nodded. She stepped away from the table, moving through the crowd toward the edge of the ballroom, and the table sat in the wreckage of the last 2 minutes, and Clifford Harrington reached for his wine with the deliberate steadiness of a man who believes he has won. He would remember this later. The wine, the steadiness, the certainty. He would remember it because of what happened next. Zara stood in the corridor outside the ballroom, one hand against the cool marble wall, the phone pressed to her ear. Dad, she said. I know. I'm here. Yes, I know where it is. Give me 5 minutes. She hung up. She stood there for a moment in the quiet of the corridor. Then she called Bennett. He's here, she said, when he picked up. My dad. He was in the city for the symposium. I didn't know he was coming tonight. He saw the event listed and... I know it's a lot. Just come out when you can. She ended the call. She straightened the shoulder of her dress, the repaired seam invisible, and she waited. Dr. Neville Okonkwo was 61 years old, and he arrived the way he did everything, without announcement, without performance, without any apparent awareness of the effect he had on a room. He was tall. Taller than his daughter, nearly taller than the doorframe, with close-cropped gray at his temples and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the unhurried posture of a man who has never needed to prove anything to anyone because his work did it for him. He wore a dark suit, well cut but not flashy, and he carried a lanyard from the International Symposium on Cardiovascular Research that he hadn't bothered to take off, which was the only clue, if you were paying attention, to where he'd just come from. He was not flashy. He did not need to be. Dr. Neville Okonkwo held the Whitmore Chair in Cardiac Surgery at the University of Toronto. He had performed over 4,000 open-heart surgeries in a career spanning 3 decades. His work on minimally invasive valve replacement had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine and cited by surgeons on 4 continents. He sat up continents. He sat on the boards of 3 hospitals and the advisory committee of the Canadian Heart and Stroke Foundation. He had trained more than 60 cardiac surgeons, practicing across North America. He was, in the world that actually mattered, not nobody. He found Zara in the corridor and pulled her into a brief, quiet hug. She was taller than him by an inch, something that had always made her smile. He looked at her face and said, in the understated way of a man who has assessed critical situations his whole life, "Rough night? Getting better," she said. Bennett came through the ballroom doors and stopped when he saw Neville. Something happened in his expression. Recognition? Recalibration. "Dad," Zara said, "this is Bennett Harrington." "Bennett, my father, Dr. Neville Okonkwo." The 2 men shook hands. Neville's grip was the grip of a surgeon, precise, practiced, exactly as long as necessary. "I've heard a great deal about you," Neville said to Bennett, in the tone of a man who means it as neither compliment nor warning, but simply as fact. "She doesn't talk about you much," Bennett said, with the ghost of a smile. "But when she does, it's clear she got her stubbornness from somewhere." Neville looked at his daughter. He's not wrong. It was at this point that Clifford Harrington appeared in the doorway. He'd come looking for Bennett. He would say, later, that he was going to apologize. But that is the kind of thing people say when the situation has already gotten away from them. What he'd actually come for was to reassert, to bring his son back into the fold on terms that were still his terms, to be magnanimous in the particular way that was really just another form of control. He came through the door and stopped. He looked at the tall man in the dark suit with the symposium lanyard, and something shifted. A small cellular level shift, the kind that happens when the brain is processing information that doesn't match the model it's been running all night. "Clifford," Bennett said, and his voice had gone very neutral. "This is Dr. Neville Okonkwo, Zara's father." Clifford stepped forward, extending his hand. The handshake. 2 seconds. "Harrington," he said, the way he always said his own name, as if it explained everything. Neville shook his hand. "Okonkwo," he said, just as simply. A silence. "I know your work," Clifford said. And the thing was, he did. Because Clifford Harrington, for all his faults, was not stupid, and he read widely, and the name Neville Okonkwo had crossed his desk twice in the past year alone. Once in a briefing about a biotech he'd been considering investing in, on whose advisory board Okonkwo sat, and once in an article in the Globe and Mail about Canadian institutions of global significance. He'd read both. He'd thought, both times, that Okonkwo was exactly the kind of person he respected. He had not connected that name to the nurse in the burgundy dress. "I know your firm," Neville said, without warmth, without hostility, with the perfect neutrality of a man who has spent a career making assessments and is making one now. Clifford's eyes moved to Zara. Something he hadn't allowed himself all evening, something like actual looking, happened in his face. "Your daughter is a nurse," he said. Not accusatory, almost confused. "My daughter," Neville said, "is a registered nurse, yes. She is also, in my biased opinion, one of the finest people I know. She chose her career because she wanted to be useful to people in the worst moments of their lives. I'm not sure what that has to do with anything." Clifford said nothing. "I understand," Neville said, in the calm tone of a man who has been in far more difficult rooms than this, "that there was some unpleasantness this evening." Clifford said, "I may have been. You told your son," Neville said without raising his voice, "that she doesn't belong here, in front of a room full of people." A pause. "I've heard this before, in different rooms, about different women who looked like my daughter." Another pause. It never gets less ugly. The corridor was very quiet. From inside the ballroom, the sound of the string quartet drifted out, thin and strange. Clifford Harrington stood in the marble corridor of the venue that bore his foundation's name and looked at the man in front of him, and for perhaps the first time in a very long evening, he was not the most significant person in the space. He said, "I made assumptions." "Yes," Neville said. "You did, I." Clifford started. and then stopped. The word that was supposed to follow, apologize perhaps or misjudged, didn't come. His mouth opened and nothing happened. And then, with a physical effort that everyone present could see, the man who had spent 50 years being in control did something he hadn't done since he couldn't remember when. He looked at Zara. "I was unkind," he said. "This evening, I was unkind to you, and it was wrong." Zara looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "It was." No more than that, she didn't soften it. She didn't accept it graciously, or offer him absolution, or make it easier for him. She just agreed with him, calmly, the way she agreed with any true statement. It was, somehow, the hardest thing he'd faced all night. Elaine appeared in the doorway. She'd followed Clifford without his knowing it, the way she'd been quietly following events for 40 years without being acknowledged. She looked at Zara, then she looked at her husband. Then she said, in a voice that was quieter than anyone had ever heard from her, "I should have said something, inside, at the table." A pause. "I'm sorry I didn't." Zara looked at Elaine Harrington. This woman who had stood at her husband's side in silence all evening, whose face had been a careful, practiced blank, and saw, perhaps for the first time, that blank for what it was. Not indifference, something much more tired than that. "Thank you," Zara said, and meant it. They stayed another 45 minutes. Not because anything was repaired, because some things can't be repaired in a corridor, in the middle of a gala, in the space of a single conversation, but because Neville Okonkwo, who had not come to the Harrington Foundation Gala intending to make anyone feel small, suggested they go back inside and have dessert. And because he said it with the matter-of-fact warmth of a man who doesn't need to make a point of having won. He and Clifford ended up talking for 20 minutes at the edge of the ballroom about a cardiovascular biotech that Neville was advising and Clifford's firm had been watching. About the state of Canadian healthcare investment. About something technical relating to clinical trials that neither Zara nor Bennett fully followed. It was not a reconciliation. It was two men talking, one of whom had spent an entire evening revealing himself, and the other of whom had simply shown up and been exactly who he was. Bennett stood with Zara near the windows overlooking King Street. Below them, the city moved in its usual indifferent way. Cabs and cyclists and the orange glow of streetlights on wet pavement. "I meant what I said," Bennett told her. "At the table, I would have walked." "I know," she said. "I need you to know that isn't new. It wasn't the moment. I would have walked a year ago." She looked at him. This man who had chosen her, tonight, in front of 300 people, at significant personal cost. She thought about Amira, asleep right now at her mother's house in Scarborough, who called Bennett Benny, because she'd decided at age 3 that his name was too long and she'd never been corrected. "I know," she said again. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, just slightly. "Your father," Bennett said, "is terrifying." "He's really not," Zara said. "He absolutely is. He just has very good posture," she said. "And he never blinks enough." Bennett laughed quietly, genuinely, in the way that she'd fallen for 14 months ago in an emergency room corridor. That's exactly what makes him terrifying. Clifford Harrington did not disown his son that night. He did not repair everything either. He went home to his house in Forest Hill and sat in his study for a long time, and he thought about a woman in a burgundy dress who had looked at him without flinching when he'd tried to make her feel small. He thought about the symposium lanyard he'd been too dismissive to notice until it was too late. He thought about his wife, who had said she was sorry in a voice he'd never heard before, and he wondered, with an unease he didn't know what to do with, whether he'd heard everything she'd said in 40 years with the same attention he'd thought he had. He called Bennett the next morning. He asked if they could have breakfast. Bennett said yes. It was a beginning. A small, complicated, inadequate beginning. But it was real. The thing about people who make you feel small is that they're usually very good at it. They've practiced, they've refined it into something precise, something that slides in under your skin before you've had time to name it. What they haven't practiced is being wrong in front of everyone they've spent their whole lives impressing. I think about Zara, that evening, standing in a corridor in a dress she altered herself, telling a man who had dismissed her all evening simply, yes, it was. No performance, no vindication speech, no moment of triumph, just the quiet, complete refusal to make it easier for him than it deserved to be. That's not something you can fake. That's not something you can perform. That's something you grow into, slowly, over years of being underestimated and deciding, at some point, that other people's ceilings are not yours to live under. I want to ask you something before you go. Have you ever been in a room where someone looked right through you? Where you were present but invisible, assessed and dismissed before you said a single word? Leave me a comment below and tell me what you did. Did you speak up? Did you hold still? Like Zara? Did you walk out? There's no wrong answer here. And if you've ever had someone in your corner, the way Bennett stood in Zara's, tell me about that too. Because I think we don't talk enough about the people who choose us, loudly, when it costs them something. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit subscribe if you're new to Dell Stories. We have a lot more where this came from. And remember, the room that doesn't recognize you today is not the room that defines you. The right people always find out who you are. Sometimes they find out in a ballroom, in front of 300 witnesses. Sometimes that's exactly enough.